My parents always said my older brother would inherit everything because he was the firstborn. When I bought my dream house, they demanded I sign it over to him. I said absolutely not. I'm Lauren, 40 years old, and I never expected that buying my own house would open a can of family drama I'm still struggling to deal with. I grew up in a household where my older brother Matt, who's 43 now, was treated like the golden child. From as far back as I can remember, my parents made it clear that he was the one who would inherit everything: the family home, the money, the legacy. Their reasoning always boiled down to the fact that he was the firstborn, which in their eyes made him the natural heir. I was the youngest, always kind of in the background, the kid who was expected to just accept it. For years, I didn't question it much. I knew my place in the family, and I didn't want to rock the boat. But as I got older, I worked hard, saved carefully, and finally, last year, I bought a house in a town I loved. It wasn't extravagant or flashy, but it was mine. I put every penny into it and designed it to be exactly what I wanted, something I could call home. At first, it felt like a huge victory. I was proud and excited. But then my family found out. About 2 months after I moved in, my parents came over for dinner. It was a casual visit at first, but then my mom and dad sat me down with this kind of serious look I hadn't seen in a long time. My mom said something that stopped me cold. "Lauren, your father and I have been thinking. You know how things have always been with Matt as the firstborn. We think it would be best if you signed the house over to him." I blinked, not quite sure I heard right. "Wait, what?" I said. Mom smiled tightly, like she was trying to stay calm. "We're just trying to keep the family legacy together. It's tradition that the firstborn inherits. We want to make sure Matt has a home for his family." I stared at them, confused and a little hurt. "But this is my house. I bought it. I worked for it." Dad chimed in quietly. "We're not trying to take it away from you. Just make sure the family stays united. It's what's best in the long run." Before I could respond, Matt walked in from the kitchen. He had that smug look he always gets when he thinks he's about to win an argument. "Lauren, it's not personal. It's just how the family works. You know how much Mom and Dad want to keep everything in one place." I could feel my chest tighten. "Matt, this is my home. I'm not signing anything over." Their faces changed slightly, like I had broken some unspoken rule. The conversation ended abruptly after that, with the mood completely soured. After that visit, things got weird. Mom started texting me constantly, sending messages about how family is important and Matt's kids need a safe place. Dad would call every few days, telling me to think about the bigger picture. Matt began showing up unannounced, sometimes with his kids, acting like they had every right to be there. It wasn't just words anymore. It became pressure. They'd leave little things at my house: extra clothes, toys for my dog, like they were marking territory. One afternoon, I found Matt's car parked in my driveway with no note or warning. I tried to set boundaries, but every time I pushed back, they'd guilt me with things like, "You're breaking the family apart," or "You're being selfish." This went on for months. I changed my locks, stopped answering some calls, and started keeping a detailed record of everything. But it still wasn't enough. Then, one day Matt showed up with a lawyer. He wasn't alone, and this time, they came prepared. The lawyer pulled out documents that basically demanded I sign over my house to Matt. They called it "Keeping the Family Estate Unified" and said it would avoid future conflict. I refused flat out, but the lawyer didn't seem surprised. He slid over a copy of a will that my parents had apparently updated recently, a will that included a clause saying Matt would inherit all properties from my parents, including any I had purchased myself. It hit me then. This was no longer about tradition. This was a calculated move to wrest control from me and keep everything under Matt's name. After that meeting with Matt and his lawyer, I thought maybe I could put some distance between myself and the chaos. But it quickly became clear that wasn't going to happen. The family had taken sides, and I was suddenly the one standing alone, labeled as the troublemaker. The days after the lawyer visit were some of the most difficult I've ever experienced. My parents' call stopped completely. At first, I thought maybe they were giving me space, but the silence felt heavy, like a punishment. The only messages I got were from Matt, and they weren't exactly friendly. One afternoon, I received a text from him. "Lauren, this isn't personal. It's about what's best for the family. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I wanted to reply, but I didn't. I was still trying to process everything and figure out my next steps. Then the subtle but constant intrusions began. Matt would stop by my neighborhood, just to check in, and I'd spot him driving slowly past my house several times a day. His kids sometimes showed up with him, which was clearly no accident. I could tell they were being used as part of his strategy to wear me down. It wasn't just the visits. I started noticing other odd things too. A few of my personal items on the porch went missing, and one morning, I found the gate to my backyard left wide open. I called the police to report it, but there wasn't much they could do without proof of trespassing. At work, I was more distracted than usual. The tension at home was eating at me, and every time I spoke to someone about it, they told me family shouldn't be like this. I agreed, but at the same time, I knew I wasn't wrong to stand my ground. Then came the invitation to a family dinner, which my parents insisted I attend. I had hoped for some kind of calm, maybe a chance to talk everything out face to face. Instead, it was a minefield. The moment I arrived, the atmosphere was cold. My parents barely made eye contact, and Matt was practically glaring at me from across the table. The conversation was strained, forced smiles and awkward silences filling the gaps. At one point, Dad cleared his throat and said, "Lauren, we've been patient, but this has gone on long enough." "Matt's right. You're making things difficult for everyone." I looked at him, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not making things difficult. I'm protecting something I earned with my own work." "Is that really so wrong?" Mom jumped in, her voice sharp. "You're tearing the family apart. Don't you see that?" It was the first time I noticed how cold and unrecognizable they had become. I realized this wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about control, about power. They wanted me to submit, to give up everything, not because it was fair, but because they believed their version of family hierarchy was law. The night ended with Matt cornering me in the hallway. He said, "You're going to regret this, Lauren. Trust me." I didn't respond. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. After that family dinner, the divide between us grew even wider, and the way my parents and Matt behaved became more calculated, more cold. It wasn't just passive pressure anymore. It felt like a campaign to wear me down, piece by piece. A few days later, I noticed subtle things around my house that made me uneasy. The mailbox was slightly bent, like someone had tried to pry it open. My garden gate, which I was sure I'd locked the night before, was again ajar. I started double and triple checking every lock before going to bed. It was no longer a safe space. It felt like a battleground. I reached out to the local police and explained what was happening. They told me to keep a log of everything unusual and promised to increase patrols around the neighborhood. That helped a little, but I could tell that this was something no one outside my family could fix. Meanwhile, Matt ramped up his visits. It was no longer just checking in. He would show up at odd hours, sometimes standing across the street, watching. His kids played in my yard, sometimes with no permission, leaving behind trash and dents on my garden fence. I confronted him once, calmly but firmly telling him to stop. His response was chilling. "They're family. You can't keep them out." The emotional strain started taking its toll. I found myself shrinking in my own home, anxious every time the doorbell rang, afraid it might be them again. I stopped inviting friends over, feeling embarrassed and vulnerable. At work, the stress was obvious. I confided in a close colleague who told me to consider mediation or to try to smooth things over. But after everything, I knew that wouldn't work. This wasn't about a misunderstanding or hurt feelings. It was about control and entitlement. My family believed they had a right to take what I had built, and they weren't going to back down. The worst moment came when I got an unexpected call from my mother. Her voice was cold, almost clipped. She told me that they had decided to cut off financial support for anything related to me. Not that I depended on them anymore, but it was a clear message. "We want you to understand the consequences of your choices," she said. I couldn't believe how far they were willing to go to force me into submission. It was like the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had turned into strangers who wanted to erase my independence. Then there was the matter of the will. I had a copy now, thanks to the lawyer I'd hired, and it was clear my parents had rewritten it to exclude me completely from any future inheritance, including any properties I purchased myself. Everything was going to Matt. I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was fighting to be recognized as a part of my family's future. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Matt's lawyer, demanding that I sign over my house within the next 2 weeks to avoid legal action. The letter was formal and cold, with a tone that left no room for negotiation. That's when I realized this wasn't just a family disagreement, it was a full-blown takeover attempt. I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. They had taken every step to isolate me, intimidate me, and erase me from their plans. But I wasn't going to back down. In fact, I started to prepare. I gathered every document related to the house, financial records, everything that proved it was mine alone. I spoke with my lawyer about filing for protection against harassment and trespassing. I knew this was going to get uglier before it got better. And then, something unexpected happened. I got a call from an old family friend, someone who had been close to my parents for years but had kept a distance during this conflict. They told me something that stopped me cold, something about a secret my parents had been hiding, something that could change everything. After that call from the family friend, I spent days turning over every word in my mind, trying to piece together what I'd been told. The friend, let's call her Eleanor, was someone I trusted, someone who had watched my family for years but never got involved. When she called, her voice was low, serious. She said she had information that could change everything about what my parents had been telling me. Eleanor explained that years ago, before my brother even bought his house, my parents had secretly taken out a second mortgage on the family estate without telling Matt. They used the money to fund Matt's business ventures and cover some personal debts. But the truth was, the estate had been more vulnerable than anyone realized, almost losing value under the weight of these hidden loans. What really caught me off guard was that Eleanor said my parents never intended for Matt to actually inherit the estate in the traditional sense. Instead, they planned to sell it piece by piece over the next few years, funneling the money through Matt's name and effectively cutting me and anyone else completely out of the picture. It was a scheme, one designed to consolidate everything under Matt's control while keeping the rest of us in the dark. No wonder they were pushing so hard to claim my house too. It was part of their plan to erase my stake before it even became a problem. I sat with this for a long time, feeling a mix of betrayal, anger, and a strange clarity. For the first time, I saw the full picture. My family wasn't just clinging to outdated ideas about birth order. They were deliberately working to take everything from me and keep it for themselves. I realized if I wanted to protect what was mine, I couldn't just sit back and defend. I needed to take the initiative. So, I started by digging deeper into the estate's finances. With Eleanor's help, I got access to public records, loan documents, and some of the financial statements my parents had hoped would stay hidden. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear the estate was burdened by debts they had kept secret, and Matt's name was tied to many of these loans. Armed with this knowledge, I went back to my lawyer. We talked strategy. I couldn't stop the will or undo the mortgages overnight, but there were ways to expose their mismanagement and put pressure on them legally and publicly if I had to. I also made a decision to turn the tables on Matt. Instead of ignoring his visits, I started documenting every interaction, taking photos of his car in my driveway, keeping notes on the trespassing, and recording conversations when I could. I was building my own file, a record that would prove I was being harassed and pressured. Meanwhile, I reached out quietly to some of Matt's business partners and associates. I hinted that there were risks in his financial dealings, risks that could come to light if things escalated. It was subtle, but it planted a seed of doubt. I wasn't trying to destroy him, just making sure he knew I wasn't powerless. Then came the small but satisfying moments of pushing back. One afternoon, Matt showed up again, unannounced as usual. This time, I met him at the door with a calm but firm voice. "Matt, your visits are unwelcome. If you come onto my property without permission again, I'll have to involve the authorities." He tried to argue, but I didn't let him get a word in. I mentioned I was already speaking to the police about past incidents. His face tightened, and for once, I saw a flicker of hesitation. I also began sharing my story carefully on social media, not naming names, but enough details to let people know what I was facing. Support poured in from friends, strangers, even distant family members who had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. After that call from Eleanor, everything shifted. The information she provided about my parents' financial mismanagement and their secret plans to funnel the family estate through Matt wasn't just troubling, it was devastating. It felt like someone had pulled back the curtain on a stage I didn't even know I was standing on. For years, I had quietly accepted being treated like the lesser child, the one who didn't need or deserve the same support. But now it was clear, this wasn't just neglect. This was a calculated attempt to write me out of the family entirely. Eleanor had kept meticulous records. She showed me documents where my parents had quietly taken out a second mortgage on the family estate, years before Matt's business had even launched. She showed me the signatures, the hidden accounts, the way everything was cleverly disguised under Matt's name to protect themselves if anything went wrong. They had taken enormous financial risks, gambled with our family history, and now they were trying to secure my home as a backup plan. I remember sitting at my dining table long after Eleanor left, the documents spread out in front of me. The house, once my refuge, now felt like a fortress under siege. But with that fear came something else: clarity. I couldn't undo what they had done, but I could stop them from going any further. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Sarah. I laid everything out: the harassment, the manipulation, the trespassing, and now the financial deception. Sarah listened without interrupting, then said, "We need to act." We began by filing for a restraining order against Matt. I documented every time he'd come by uninvited, every message he sent, every incident with his children entering my property. The judge granted the order without much hesitation. Matt was now legally required to stay away from my home and cease all direct contact. Then came the larger move: challenging the will. Sarah filed a petition to invalidate the most recent version based on undue influence and lack of transparency. Simultaneously, we reported the undisclosed financial activities to the state's real estate and banking authorities. Investigators were assigned, and soon they were combing through the tangled web of accounts, property deeds, and loan applications. My parents, once composed and commanding, started to panic. I received a curt letter from them, claiming I was disrespecting the family legacy. They tried to frame my actions as betrayal, but by now their words carried no weight. They had long since forfeited any right to moral high ground. Matt, meanwhile, attempted to paint himself as the victim. He claimed he had no knowledge of the mortgage or the loans, that he was merely following our parents' wishes. But the paper trail didn't lie. His name was on too many documents, and his hands were too deep in the family finances to plead ignorance. When the investigation concluded, the findings were strong. My parents had taken out multiple loans using the estate as collateral, funneling the money into Matt's ventures and personal accounts. They had failed to disclose these liabilities to any future heirs, violating state laws. The estate was placed under legal supervision and frozen pending full restitution. My parents were fined heavily, and their remaining financial authority over the estate was revoked. As for the will, it didn't survive the light of day once it was brought into court. After weeks of testimony, document review, and expert analysis, the judge ruled unequivocally that it had been drafted under undue influence. There was compelling evidence that Matt and my parents had collaborated to exclude me, emails exchanged behind closed doors, financial movements that coincided suspiciously with the timing of the revisions, and a troubling pattern of isolation and manipulation. It was clear to the court that I hadn't simply been forgotten in the will. I had been deliberately written out. In response, the judge ordered that the will be invalidated and removed from probate. An impartial executor, someone with no familial ties and a reputation for being methodical and fair, was appointed to handle the estate moving forward. The judge stated that the distribution process would start from scratch, with all assets and liabilities reassessed in the presence of legal oversight. I was reinstated as an equal heir, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. But more than that, more than the estate or the legal acknowledgement, what mattered most was my home. The court formally recognized that the house I lived in was legally mine and had never been a part of any family-held trust or joint asset. It had been purchased independently, with my income, my savings, and my choices. It had no financial ties to the estate and was therefore off-limits to any family claim. The judge's declaration wasn't just a legal win, it felt like a moral one. My sanctuary, my safe place, remained untouched. There were no apologies. Not from my parents. Not from Matt. Not a word of remorse or ownership. To them, I had betrayed some unwritten family code by refusing to give in, by fighting back instead of quietly handing over what they believed was theirs. They didn't lash out. They didn't plead. They simply vanished into silence. Calls stopped. Messages ceased. Holiday invites, such as they were, dried up completely. The silence was sudden and heavy. At first, I thought it would break me. That kind of rejection, so final, so cold, was harder than I'd imagined. Even after everything, some part of me had held out hope that there would be an acknowledgement, even a small one, that what they'd done was wrong. But instead, they chose erasure. And strangely, after the initial sting wore off, that silence became liberating. I realized it was the first time in my adult life I wasn't performing for their approval or fighting for scraps of respect. They were gone, and I was still standing. The months that followed were hard in a different way. The fight was over, but the emotional residue lingered. I cycled through anger, grief, and a quiet sort of guilt. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I had to grieve the loss of something I never really had, a family that acted with fairness, that offered unconditional love. I went to therapy. I journaled late into the night. I tried to piece together a new definition of what family meant. Each day, though, I grew a little stronger. I made small changes around the house that gave me joy. I planted a garden in the backyard, a riot of herbs, tomatoes, and flowers that bloomed defiantly in the spring. I repainted the front door a vibrant shade of blue, something I'd always wanted but never done because it felt too bold for my parents' tastes. I had friends over for brunches and movie nights, filling the space with warmth and laughter that had been missing for far too long. The house stopped being a battleground. Slowly, it transformed back into a home. Mine. And as I healed, something unexpected happened. I reconnected with some extended family, cousins, and relatives who had quietly distanced themselves over the years. When word got around about what had happened, a few reached out. Some offered support. Others shared their own stories of being overlooked or manipulated. The common thread was always the same. Matt had been the golden child, and the rest of us had been expected to accommodate him, even at our own expense. For the first time, I didn't feel like the outlier. I wasn't alone. We met for dinners, talked late into the night, exchanged old photos and stories. I began to understand that while I lost the illusion of one kind of family, I was gaining another, one built on mutual respect, not obligation. And in those connections, I found something that had been missing my whole life: acceptance without condition. Today, things are calm, peaceful, even. My home is safe, filled with reminders of my own choices and achievements. My finances are secure. I've rebuilt a support network. The estate is still under legal administration, and while I doubt I'll ever fully reconcile with my parents or Matt, that chapter is closing. There's still a pang of sadness now and then, especially during holidays, but it's not the aching emptiness it once was. It's more like the echo of something that used to be loud. One of the most empowering changes came when I began volunteering. I started speaking to small groups about financial abuse and coercion within families, something that's still not talked about enough. I shared my story in workshops and support groups, and in doing so, I discovered a purpose I hadn't expected. If my experience can help someone else see the signs sooner or find the strength to stand up for themselves, then everything I went through will carry meaning beyond just personal justice. Looking back, I didn't just protect a house. I fought for a piece of myself that I didn't even realize I'd been trying to reclaim. My independence, my dignity, my voice. And I won. The house stands exactly as I dreamed it would, not because someone gave it to me, not because it was passed down, but because I earned it. Every inch of it. Every tile, every nail, every blade of grass. I made this life, and no one can take that from me again. And that, finally, feels like justice.